So I said it's often important to get different perspectives of Brexit and how it affects other people's mindset and how they see our decision to leave. Now this is, I think, quite an interesting article from The Independent, and basically the headline says it all. I'm Greek and I'm sick of my country being used by Leave supporters to justify a self-harming hard Brexit. So let's see what he has to say then. So even now, Greece, my native country, is still used by Leave supporters to justify a self-harming Brexit. On Saturday, Boris Johnson was comparing Theresa May's Chequers deal to the humiliation meted out to Greece by the EU. He may have had a point, but it wasn't him and his party that have been against the regulation of the banking and financial sectors that created the 2010 economic crash, and ideologically committed to the policies of austerity that have impoverished millions across Europe. This is why when Greece is presented as a one-word rationale for Britain leaving the EU, my first reaction is anger, followed by genuine puzzlement. This argument ignores, firstly, the neoliberal influence of Britain within the EU. Secondly, the fact that neoliberalism and austerity in Britain did not come from the EU, but from successive national governments that promote cuts, privatisation and the destruction of the welfare state. This makes every reference to Greece nothing more than a smokescreen. In the case of Greece, these policies were imposed on a country as part of the financial rescue programme, the terms of which were decided to a large extent by the European and the International Monetary Fund. This is why the Greek finance minister Yanis Vokias, I think that's how you say it, has a lot to say about the European, and possibly this is why he is against Brexit. What is for sure, though, is that Britain does not belong to the Eurozone club, and neither is it in the negotiations with the IMF. The government debt has soared to 172% of GDP in 2011. What was Greece supposed to do? According to Brexit supporters, go back to your national currency is the immediate response. But for those who think national currencies solve all economic ills, in the past week we have witnessed the Turkish, for example, and even the Turkish lira, the currency of the largest emerging economy, cannot withstand an economic war. You should have left the EU, Brexiteers also insist, and yet this is clear that they are far from recognising the political complexities that could follow, not least since we don't have any precedent yet. More importantly, more often than not, they fail to take into account that Greece was at the same time at the front line of receiving thousands of refugees, and despite my personal feelings towards Angela Merkel's government, it is important to recognise that Germany in 2015 received 895,000 asylum applications. Would the borders have remained open if Greece was exiting the EU? It is doubtful, as this could have been another way to put pressure on Greece. There is no space here to explore how a bigger migration crisis would have affected the power dynamics in the region, but this is one of the myriad complications of Greece leaving the EU that Brexiteers completely dismiss. And I've said this 100 times before, and I'm really starting to see this, that a lot of other people on YouTube, especially all these people who class themselves as like political commentators, and I don't class myself as a political commentator. I just come in here and I talk about things I find certainly interesting going on in the world. I would never class myself as a political commentator, but people who do class themselves as that take a very, very... It's like they claim to have read a book on a subject, but in reality they've only read the first chapter and have taken all their cues and ideas from the first chapter but discard any ideas that might come up in later chapters. It's such a shallow reading often these types of people give out, and that's what really annoys me about a lot of these things. So anyway, the article continues. They risk falling into the same trap when discussing the UK's departure from the EU. The ignoring of the existence of the other side, which is meanwhile calculating how it can use the negotiating environment to advance its own interests. So far, every Tory proposal has been nothing more than an attempt to appease an increasingly anxious public when it is destined to fail considering the EU's red lines. The Brexiteers' purported solution to the Tory deadlock is the reversal to the World Trade Organization rules in a catastrophic no-deal scenario. It is too damaging for a sensible politician even to comprehend. And while some in the Tory government are trying to convince us that it is an unhitched process of Rotero Alved, the head of the WTO, explains that this will require the agreement by other member countries, and some of which will use this opportunity to their advantage. The more astonishing is that the argument for a no deal is sometimes made by Eurosceptics on the left as well, as in their collective memory loss, regarding the role of the WTO as an organisation promoting economic competition, widening the gap between the wealthy and the developing countries, offering no protection either to labour or the environment. So please stop using Greece as a justification for your ill-conceived arguments. The reality of Brexit is that the British people are about to lose a lot and gain nothing. The EU is in need of urgent reform, but everyone with experience in negotiations knows that it is a bad idea to give up on your rights on the basis of vague promises. In every negotiation, you have to retain what you already have in order to make further gains. Exactly the opposite of what Britain is about to do. It is in delirium and a self-harming arrogance. As for Greece, the victim of the Eurozone's structural problems and the rigid adherence to neoliberal doctrine, it is true that Britain simply staying in the status quo EU is not going to change those conditions, but Britain with a Labour government working within the EU could change the balance of power towards a more social, even socialist Europe. This could mean a lot for Greece and all countries hit by the crisis. And that's essentially true. I agree with what this guy says, but I also disagree in the fact that you have to look at Greece's economy. Greece's economy wasn't exactly the strongest thing in the world, but again, if you look deeper, why Greece crashed out in the first place. A lot of it doesn't have to do with the Eurozone. It was to do with their own country's, economic problems and economic, at the time, solutions they wanted to do. Even Guy, what's his name now? Guy van der Stad, I think that's him, said in the European Parliament, we know you want to do all these socialist programs, but if you don't have the money to do these socialist programs, you can't really do them. Especially when you're looking at the economics of running a country, it's very hard to say, yeah, we want to do all these socialist things, which, again, great, and I agree with a lot of the socialist things that the guy wanted to do, but if you don't have the money for it and your economy isn't up to the task of running it, I mean, now that Greece is out of that area now, we'll have to see what happens next, especially to Greece. What will happen going forward? So it'd be interesting to see and watch what happens to Greece. It would actually be the funniest thing in the world if once we left, Greece basically recovers and its economy does become a more flourishing place because of the Eurozone. I do expect that to actually happen, and it will be the hilarious thing in the world because our economy will be going down the shitter at that time. So, yeah. Like I say, always read what other people have to say, especially when it's about your country, because getting a different viewpoint is very interesting.